Kathleen, thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this series, The Future is Calling Us to Greatness.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome. I think I first encountered your work in a video that somebody alerted me to maybe a year and a half ago. You and Carl Safina, I recall, and several others. And I immediately then bought your book, Moral Ground. And one of the things I love about your thinking, actually, before I even go into that and we get into sort of the formal conversation, some of the people who are watching this or listening to this may not be familiar with you and your work. And so could you please just sort of give our listeners and viewers a sense of, who is Kathleen Dean Moore? What are you particularly passionate about, and how did you get to this place?
Well, I call myself an environmental advocate, and I'm particularly concerned about climate change, as we all are. My background is I have a PhD in philosophy, and for many years I taught at Oregon State, primarily ethics. I am also a writer, a nature writer, and for many years I wrote books that celebrate the natural world. But it's increasingly difficult to celebrate the natural world, and it's increasingly difficult to stay inside the walls of a university when this whole world is calling to us. So my work now is entirely climate change.
Fabulous. That's awesome. And what I love about Connie and I woke up to climate change in a really personal way about a year and a half ago when we watched David Roberts' TEDx talk, Climate Change is Simple. And it went from back burner to front burner at that time. And in fact, we created, I think 6 or 7 days after our wake-up call, we created a video called Climate Change Intergenerational Justice or Intergenerational Evil or something like that. And I love the way you bring sort of this deep grounding in moral philosophy and empathy and a sense of the importance of the moral imagination. And so what I'd love for you to do is to share how you see this as a moral crisis that requires a moral response, and a little bit about how you've been speaking about that around the country, around the world.
Sure. I had a similar wake-up call as you did. I was with my granddaughter and putting her to sleep, and how she gets to sleep is she sings herself to sleep. And she was singing laugh kookaburra until she fell fast asleep. And I just said to myself, it's over. I can't do anything in my life but make a world that's safe for the laughter of children.
Yeah.
And that's been my focus ever since. My view is that although climate change is a scientific problem, it's a technological problem. In many ways, it's an economic problem, a national security problem. It's primarily a moral problem, and it calls for a moral response. And that what we need, I believe, is a moral consensus that's as strong as a scientific consensus. So scientists have done such a heroic job of convincing us that, and giving us reason to believe that climate change is real, it's dangerous, it's upon us, and created this global consensus. And now what we need, I think, is a equally strong reasoned moral consensus that climate change is a moral outrage, that it can't be allowed to occur. So I've been corresponding with a number of the world's moral leaders. We wrote letters to 100 of them, and we asked them this question: do we have a moral obligation to the future to leave a world as rich in possibilities as our own? We got back the most extraordinary responses, all short little essays, and we put them together into a book. The book is called Moral Ground. And what they do is they fall into 14 different reasons why we really must act, why we have an affirmative moral responsibility. And the reasons range from, for the sake of the children, to honor our duties to steward this world that has been given as a gift to us. This is a matter of moral integrity, on and on I could go with all these important reasons. Human rights, justice, so that as you open this book, you see them all beautifully expressed, all the different reasons why we cannot fail to respond to this call.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I loved about the book, is that it came from so many different angles with so many different voices, really around a common set of values and priorities and commitments and moral sensibility that was really all about what I call honoring the past and being of service to the future in a deep way, falling in love with life and doing all that we can, whatever it takes, to ensure a just and sustainably life-giving future. But what I love about the book, in fact, the subtitle, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril, and it brought, dozens of voices to this question. So no matter where someone was at, or someone is at on the theological or philosophical or metaphysical spectrums, they found voices they could resonate with and respect that were speaking sort of their language in terms of really loving the future and seeing that how we live in the moment, how we live today, individually and collectively, especially systemically, collectively, is vital for how our children and grandchildren, and not just our children and grandchildren, but the children and grandchildren, as my mentor Thomas Berry used to like to say, of all species,
Yes.
the world that they will inhabit.
I'm so glad that you brought up love, because this was a recurring theme in these essays. What do you love too much to lose? Is it justice that you love? Is it your children you love? Is it the little sea angels in the ocean and the salmon? And then the question is, love imposes obligations. Love isn't just a kind of la-di-da. To love something is to affirm its value and to pledge your life to its survival. And so what are the moral consequences of loving? So that loving isn't just an empty phrase, but is really a devotion. It becomes a way of life. That, I think, is the key question for climate action.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I did a program last night at a church here in the Colorado Springs area. And there was a woman who came up afterwards, and we were talking, and she shared something that I had never heard before, because we were talking about different religious groups are beginning to find their way into climate as a profound moral issue. And the example she gave, she said that she was at a church, I forget what kind of church, in Florida, but I guess it was conservative. And she said there were these groups of evangelicals, and one of them said, yeah, climate change is absolutely a pro-life issue. And I thought, wow, that's a great way to phrase it.
That is a wonderful way to phrase it, and it is exactly right. It is a pro-life issue. All of those little burning lives.
Yeah.
All of them. And you start thinking about the extinctions that are going to result if we don't prevent it from climate change. Huge numbers of extinctions. I think about how we can start tearing the pages out of our field guides. It's just unbelievable. It's hard to imagine.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a powerful image, tearing the pages out of our field guides. Yeah, I've begun speaking about this from a sort of a new slant, namely that God, reality, I use the words God and reality interchangeably, that God is reality's sacred or mythic name and reality is God's secular name. And so the question then becomes, how do we live in right relationship to reality today and ensure that future generations are also able to live in a thriving relationship to reality, whatever our names for reality may be. And of course, then the question becomes, how is reality communicating to us today? And who are the prophets? Who are those who are speaking on behalf of reality and doing so with unflinching authority? And I see you as one of those people, even though you don't use that kind of religious language a whole lot. But could you say a little bit about sort of, as the people that you've been in communication with, who get it, who get that these, they don't need to be convinced that we face unprecedented challenges and that ours is a heroic time. Ours is a time to truly sacrifice, to voluntarily restrain our own needs and serving our own needs in order to be a blessing, in order to be a contribution to the future. So the people that you've been in communication with who get it, share if you could just, some perspective or stories or anything that our listeners and viewers might find inspiring.
Many of them are talking about the stories we tell each other about our relationship to the world. Philosophers, and I'm sure you do too, talk about the three great questions of humankind. What is the world? What is the place of a human in the world? And how then shall we act? And it's very clear that we've come to the end of a great experiment where we tested the idea that humans were apart from the world, that we were somehow better than it, that we were in charge and in control. That experiment is at an end. The results are in. And so our challenge is this great exercise of the moral imagination to think again about who we are. and to rejoice in our relation to the natural world, and to understand then the moral consequences of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So when many of the people in the book are talking about the new story.
Yeah. Yeah, well, what Thomas Berry and Brian Swim called the universe story, and what's now David Christian and Bill Gates and company are calling big history. There's different ways that Connie and I, our main website is thegreatstory.org. So we're talking about this 13.8 billion year creation story that we now have, that's been given by science, given by evidence, that helps us see how we're all related to all of life, how we are we aren't separate from nature, that we are nature becoming conscious of itself. It's a glorious story, and that's one of the reasons why I'm evangelistic about it. Is because,
yes, exactly.
I want as
How
many
could
people.
that be a diminishment? How could that be a diminishment? To understand ourselves as connected and deeply related to these other glorious beings.
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, it has to do with maybe some coaching you might be able to, or might be willing to give me, around how I can most effectively communicate to sort of traditional conservative Christians who still have something like 41%, I believe, the last poll that I saw, 41% of Americans believe that these are the end times. And so if that's your worldview, if you believe that Jesus is coming back in some kind of literal otherworldly way, and we've got at most a few decades left, and the challenging, the chaos of today is just signs that that's happening. I'm groping with how to most effectively reach those folk, because that's a huge voting block. That's a huge number of people. We just can't ignore them. I'm trying to bring them, to entice them, to allure them into an evidential, ecological, evolutionary worldview. But sometimes I just want to sort of, have the Old Testament prophet stance, like we're betraying God, we're betraying future generations, and I realize that's probably not always the most effective way of doing it. And so any coaching that you'd be willing to give me in terms of, or what you found helpful in terms of how you speak to conservative religious people to invite them to fall in love with life and to make a real moral commitment to the future.
Well, I should confess first that my primary work is preaching to the choir. And I very much believe that that's important, because if 41% of the people are not on board, that means that 59, almost 60% of the people are. And if they would act in accordance with their beliefs, that the struggle is over. So really calling to action those people who are already on board, I think, is very important work. The choir is tired. The choir is needing new words to the songs. And the choir is hypocritical. And so if we can address those issues with those people, then I think that's really important. So that's the work I've taken on.
Yeah.
I congratulate you and thank you for the work you've taken on. I suppose, speaking as a person completely outside of this challenge, that if Jesus is coming back, I would really want to have my house in order.
Yeah.
And I would really want to be sure that I was living in ways that honored his Father's creation.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is important is that is the renunciation of a consequentialist point of view. If the world is ending, they say, there's nothing that I can do now that's going to make any difference. Well, that's not why we do what's right. Not because we think we're going to save the world. We do what's right because we think it's right. Mm-hmm. So a call to conscience, a call to moral integrity, I think is a strong point to make in times that really seem to have very little hope for us to cling to.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, why do I live gratefully? Because I think life is a great gift. Why do I live simply? Because I don't believe it's right to take more than my fair share. Not because I think that I'm going to save the world.
Yeah, that's beautifully said. You actually reminded me of a conversation that I had with David Gershon, a dear friend and mentor of mine, and he also was sort of reminding me of social diffusion theory, and that going after the most reluctant, the most recalcitrant is not actually the most successful strategy for change.
Interesting, yeah.
In fact, the analogy he uses is, if you get the choir, you get 15%, 18, 20% of a population doing whatever. You get the choir singing, and let them get the congregation sing. Don't go after the laggards or the late majority.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
The choir is huge. And was it 61, 70% of American people think that there should be action on renewable energies. And of that number, something like 70% is discouraged, disappointed, feeling hopeless. If we can make a difference to that, then I think we can make all the difference in the world.
Yeah, I agree. I'm curious. I don't know the answer to this question, so I'd really be curious to hear who are some of the people or movements that you've found particularly inspiring in your own ecological spiritual pilgrimage. Like who have been your mentors or the people that have been most inspiring to you, and why?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Brian Swim's work because Brian Swim and Mary Evelyn Tucker, their beautiful work on the journey of the universe, I
Yes.
believe, I think is very inspirational. They're able to convey the glory, really that's the word, the glory of creation and the glory of our part in that creation. And call us not to think of ourselves, we human beings, as a cancer on the land, but to think of ourselves as part of the creative unfolding. And with responsibilities that come along with that position. That I think has been very, very important. The other half of me goes to Aldo Leopold, who is an ecologist, and many other ecologists too, who have brought me to this world and invited me to think of myself as deeply embedded in it. Uh, so from both angles, and I know this reflects on your work as too, also from the history of religion and from this emergence of ecology, you come to the same worldview as this beautiful, beautiful merging now that's unfolding.
Yeah, yeah, amen. I've begun speaking about religion, what I'm calling religion 3.0. It's not a regional religion that began in one part of the world and then is expanding. I see religion 1.0 as sort of tribal religion. It's the religion or the life ways of indigenous peoples. Religion 2.0 are the religions of the book, and sort of culturally distinct and from where they emerged and sort of their belief systems. And religion 3.0 I see as sort of a global meta-religious perspective. It's not a religion in competition with other existing religions. It's more a set of values, priorities, and commitments that are uniting tens of millions of us around the world. Some of us are completely secular. Some of us are religious of all different kinds. But what we align around is the need to live in right relationship to reality, as evidentially known and collectively discerned, and the need to ensure a just, healthy, and sustainably life-giving future. And we can differ on a lot of other things, but if we align on that, the need to live in right relationship to reality as collectively understood and the need to ensure a healthy future, those other differences, sort of just, they can be beautiful. I find we don't have to worry about them. In fact, my own personal creed or credo, sort of trying to articulate sort of where I find inspiration, and others have resonated, many others have resonated with this language. I say it's in 6 points. I say reality is my God, evidence is my scripture, big history is my creation story, and ecology is my theology. Integrity is my salvation, and ensuring a just and healthy future is my mission. And that sort of sensibility is something that I think unites a whole bunch of us, religious and non-religious alike.
I think you're right. My colleague and I have taken the Moral Ground book all over the country, spoken in many, many places, and we do workshops with it. And we start by asking people, what are your deepest values? What do you most deeply believe and treasure? What do you love too much to lose? Trying to get people to go right to the core. And we find almost universal agreement.
Wow, that's great. I love
Yeah.
it. What do you love too much to lose? That's great. That's a great question. Yeah,
Yes, and the first answer often comes in, well, it's the next generations, it's my children and my grandchildren, and then by analogy, all the children of the world.
yeah,
So it's this renewed growth, it's this future that people treasure.
yeah.
It's also a relationship with something greater than they are. Often that turns out to be a florist or a place. Sometimes it turns out to be a divine being, but something that takes them outside of themselves and their own limitations. And then the notion that you're talking about of thriving, of this kind of joyous flourishing. It's in every human being, this collection. So your notion of religion 3.0 that is broad-based and just grows out of people's shared values, I think is very, very important. And one more thing, if I may, is that when people ask me what my religion is, I tell them that I believe in the secular sacred, that I really believe that this world is astonishing, it's wondrous, it's beautiful, it is crazy creative, it's irreplaceable, it's mysterious. And if the good English word for that is sacred, then I'd be happy to accept that word.
I love it. Very recently, a few weeks ago, I delivered a TEDx talk in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It's not even up online yet. But I in that talk, I've started using this language. That's why I love the secular sacred, because I've started using language that I'm a sacred realist, or I'm an evidential mystic, and I practice factual faith.
Very nice.
Trying to
Very
pair
nice.
these secular terms and religious terms in a way that some fresh, or at least opens up new possibilities for folk.
But the paradox is a paradox often reveals something new, and that's why it's really important to bring together ideas that don't usually mesh,
Yeah.
to shake loose something that's true and complicated and interesting in new ways. Good for you.
Yeah. Well, I've come to see. I mean, I used to hold this dichotomy, the sacred and the secular, and I just don't anymore. For me, the secular is simply a way of saying a secular orientation is one that doesn't take scriptural authority as more authoritative than evidence. It doesn't take anything as more authoritative than evidence. That evidence is scripture, evidence is divine revelation. And even if secular people don't use that kind of religious language, that evidence provides our best map of what's real and what's important. And so I celebrate the ongoing emergence of the secular. I just want to also invite people who identify themselves as secular to also fall in love with life, and to not fall into this sort of existential, well, there's just no meaning, there's no purpose, there's no value beyond ourselves, and to really be present to the mystery, to the divine, if you want to use that language, but you don't even have to the awesome, to the inspiring aspects of reality, both our inner reality and our external reality, and then, as we've been saying, being of service to the future in some way.
Yes, and so what you're inviting is a kind of trust in the evidence of the evidence of our minds, also trust in the evidence of our hearts. That our feelings of reverence, our feelings of awe, our feelings of wonder and astonishment are true. And we should pay attention to them rather than discounting them in some way. I
Yes.
think that's an important thing, that we come to know. There are many, many ways to come to know, and we need to honor them all.
Yeah. Amen. Well, I just watched something that that was up online. I got an email about it. I think Humans in Nature or something like that. And Connie and I just watched it this morning. And there were a couple of things that you shared there that I wanted to also invite you to share anything you'd like to. One of them had to do with the moral imagination, this ability to get inside the. My own way of phrasing it is inside the shoes, the skin, or the scales of other beings, and feel from their perspective. And so, anything that you'd like to share about the moral imagination and how to extend that sense of in-group to include beyond where perhaps your grandparents defined their in-group.
I can't think of a capability that's more important at this time than the ability to imagine yourself inside someone else's spirit, shall we just say. It's about imagination, it's about empathy, it's about accepting grief. I think that if we weren't so afraid of being frightened and alone, and we weren't so afraid of being disregarded, that we might have more of the ability to welcome the perspective of other beings. If we once start thinking about how it must be for animals who are the last perhaps of their kind, animals who are finding toxins, animals who are losing their habitats, we really start imagining ourselves in that way, that will be a heart load of grief. So it's no wonder that we don't practice that regularly. But this is going to be our task, isn't it? Is to open our hearts to what is present. And if the evidence is an evidence of suffering, then, as you say, this is something that we have to pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, what you're sharing, and I'm so glad you brought it up, because I'd thought earlier in our conversation of mentioning Joanna Macy, because she's another one of my main mentors. And I think I find her work, as I suspect you do too, to be so valuable precisely in helping us to both get inside the experience of others, even non-human or other than human creatures, beings, the whole Council of All Beings sort of thing that she and John C. did, but also to honor the grief, to honor the sadness, to honor the anger, to be present to those very difficult emotions in community. Because when we vocalize, when we can share our despair, our grief, we find our hearts. We don't do that, as Joanna says, because we're afraid of our hearts breaking. Well, that's exactly what happens. But they break open with compassion, so that we feel our relationship, our interconnectedness with all beings, and that unleashes a lot of energy, in my experience.
I think that's right. I know that's right. Yeah. I call that the duty of the moon. That we have to take on the duties of the moon, which never looks away. It never turns its face away. It always is witness. Even as the moon turns, it's a witness.
The duty of the moon.
We're called to, isn't it? We're called to witness and not to turn our faces away.
That's beautiful. I've never heard that phrase, the duty of the moon, or anything like that. I like that.
Well, I work with writers, and I have just recently issued a call to writers, and one of the things that I call them to is this notion of witness, which I have described as the duty of the moon. We have to be out there telling the truth, even if people don't believe us. Cassandra comes to mind, who had the gift of foresight and tore her hair and cried in grief because people didn't believe her. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That has to be okay.
Yeah. One of the things that you shared in the conversation that I listened to earlier today was that you are trying to help create a national conversation about our obligation to the future, and that a new set of virtues might be being called forth. Could you say something about either of those?
Yes. If we take seriously what the ecologists tell us about the world and our place in it, then I think a certain set of moral duties come from that. If the world is finite and has actual limits, then we're called to a certain kind of self-restraint. If the world is gracious and giving as it is, then we're called to a kind of gratitude. You see how I'm proceeding?
Mm-hmm,
in beginning with some sort of fact, some sort of fact that the ecologists tell us about, and saying that that's not simply a fact about the world, although it is that. It also has moral import because it tells us then what we ought to do. So that's almost a kind of, I hesitate to use the word, but it's almost a moral biomimicry. Can we make ourselves match in some way with with the way the world works? And I believe that in your talk you also referred to that the world works one way. You were quoting someone. I'm sorry, I can't pull it up. The world works one way and our minds work another way, and that mismatch is what causes so much harm and so much grief. So let's be careful about the way the world works, and then let's see if we can in some way bring ourselves to be integrated in and worthy of that way of working. So if the world is regenerative, if the world is able to restore itself and to flourish again, then we are called also to a kind of forgiveness, and we are called also to lives that are lives of regeneration and nourishment for the world. And we're called to return the gifts of the world with our own gifts of restoration. So I'm quoting from what's called the Blue River Declaration. The group that I founded called a number of people to the mountains to think about this, scientists, ethicists, writers, and began with those three questions. What is the nature of the world? What is the place of people in that world? And then we tried to generate a set of answers to that third question. How then shall we live? So that can be found online, that set of new virtues.
Well, that was what I was just going to ask you about, because I thought this, I'm always now thinking about how to create litanies or poems or something that can be used in a ritualistic context that reaffirms this sort of deep ecological wisdom and helping us. Helps us come into right relationship with reality. And so you're saying that what you just were articulating can be found if someone Googles Blue River Declaration?
Yes, they'll find it under that name.
Okay, that's great.
That's right.
That's great, thanks. Yeah, I'm actually working with several other ministers of different denominations and faiths to try to come up with a sort of a lectionary or a sort of science-based ecological set of readings and prayers and litanies that could be used in any kind of religious setting or ritualistic setting that helps reinforce these values and worldview. So.
Yes, and music perhaps. Yes, I'm glad you're doing that. We who have left the church have not left behind the emotional, what is the word for it? The celebratory language of the church. We have not left behind the harmonious music. We haven't left behind the call and response. And these things are so deeply in us that I think that you're absolutely on the right track, absolutely doing the right thing. You just stand in a church and you hear the human capacity to sing in harmony, and you think, we can make this work.
We have to make this work, right? Exactly.
Yes, we do. And we have it within us.
Yes, yeah. Well, I actually fell in love with my now wife, Connie Barlow. We've been together for 13 years, and I fell in love with her first through her nature writing, her science writing, where she had a book, Green Space, Green Time, The Way of Science. It's really the spirituality of science, and it's all about how to fall in love with life. And in fact, she interviewed in that book both Mary Evelyn Tucker and Brian Swim, who are dear friends and colleagues and mentors. But she has in the appendix a ritual, a stardust ritual, based on what we now know about stellar nucleosynthesis, that our bodies are made of stardust. And I read that ritual and I just wept and I said, I love this woman. And that was before I ever met her.
And then you tracked her down and found her.
Amen. Amen.
And it turns out you do love this woman.
I really do.
Isn't that great?
Yes, yes. Well, Kathleen, anything that you'd like to share? Because the title of this conversation series is "The Future is Calling Us to Greatness." And anything that you would like to share, perhaps something that you share with young people, that anyone who perhaps is still feeling overwhelm or depression or anger, which are all healthy, normal emotions when you get climate and you get some of the other large-scale global challenges. Anything that you could offer that would be encouraging or inspiring for folks in this sense that the future is calling us to greatness?
Well, I think that's a beautiful phrase. Yes, when I speak to young people, what I find is that they absolutely get it. They have been beautifully educated on this. They know exactly what's coming down, and they don't know what to do. But everything that seems to be offered to them is some sort of a sacrifice or some sort of a relinquishment, and it's so sad. And so I quote Frederick Buechner, and I say, if you're looking for your calling, you'll find it at the intersection of your deepest joy and the world's greatest need. What do you love? I say to them. What can you not do? What keeps you up at night? What would you die for? What are you good at? Which is this joyous question. Yes, I can do this. I love doing this. I can spin music. I can ride a bike. And then how will you turn that to the working, the uses and the needs of the world? That I think helps the young people.
Yeah.
The people of my generation and younger and so forth who get it also don't know what to do. And we're seeing, I think, the development of what Mary DeMacher calls the new deniers. There were the old deniers who simply say, it's not happening. And then there were dangers, but, there are not that many of them, and we can, I think, let them go. They will learn. Everyone has a capacity to learn. The danger is from the new deniers who say, yes, it's here, it's real, it's dangerous, and there is nothing that we can do. That's a huge cohort of people.
Yeah.
And it's extremely dangerous.
Yeah.
So I point out the fallacious reasoning there being an old logician, that on the one hand you have blind hope, where you say, everything's going to be fine, so I don't have to do anything. And so that's a kind of moral abdication. I don't have to do anything. On the other hand, you say, well, the only other option to that is this blinding despair. And if everything is going to go to hell, no matter what I do, then I don't have to do anything. Either way, I'm off the hook. Moral abdication each way. And I say that's a false dichotomy. It ignores this broad ground, this moral ground between them, which is integrity, which is acting in ways you believe are right because you believe they're right.
Yeah.
And regardless of the consequences, Americans are so bizarrely consequential. But can we focus instead on this matching between our actions and our beliefs? Can we imagine ourselves free of those who would make us foot soldiers in the war against what we love more than anything else in the world? Can we design a life that is a work of art, that embodies our deepest values? Yes, the answer to those questions is absolutely we can.
Yes.
Is it a sacrifice? It is not. Is it an imprisonment? It is an absolute liberation.
Yes. Amen. Yeah, I'm so glad you went into that, because that was one of my notes, was to ask you about this sort of this spectrum that so many people tend to fall at one end or the other. What John Michael Greer calls the myth of perpetual progress on the one end, the sort of blind hope, and then the myth of the apocalypse at the other. It doesn't matter what we do, the whole thing's going to hell in a handbasket anyway. And I love you talking about moral integrity as this middle ground where we're engaged to be in action, to do something, to do, Joanna Macy calls it active hope, that doing something in the right direction where your joy and the world's needs intersect. I had been using that for years before somebody reminded me that I had originally got it from Frederick Buechner, and I'd completely forgotten that I'd read it in the 1980s, because I had been using it with audiences for years. And finally somebody said, "Did you know that Frederick Buechner was saying the same thing?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I never gave him credit." So there you go.
There you go.
Yeah. I want to mention one thing that you might be interested. Connie Barlow, my wife, asked me specifically to bring this up. She created, because some of our viewers and listeners would be interested in this too, because it's something that any of us can do. One of the things I tell people is that, we can all do little things. We can all change our light bulbs and drive less and fly less, and all that's great. But the most important thing that we can do for the next, until it's done, until we actually do it, is the one systemic shift, which is to, whether you call it fee and dividend or tax carbon or whatever, but to basically marshal the power of the market to help us all do the right thing. And so I always encourage people to go to citizensclimatelobby.org or carbontax.org and learn more about how they can participate in furthering that, so that we can all look young people in the eyes in another 2, 3, 4, 5 years and say, yes, I helped make that happen. So that's a concrete thing that we can all do. But the other, the other one
is, say more than, yes, I helped make that happen. It has to be, yes, I did everything I could.
Yes. I love it. Yeah, you just upped the ante. I'll use that.
But it is, it's a matter of integrity, isn't it? To divestment. If I don't believe in fossil fuels and I'm making money from selling and buying them, that is an absolute lack of integrity. So pushing our institutions too. I think you're right that the forces of the marketplace, as much as we might not feel comfortable with them, are powerful, and they should be directed towards the common good.
Yeah. Well, another thing, and this is the thing that I wanted to mention that Connie is involved in, is it's called Leaf a Legacy, Leaf, Leaf a Legacy. And it's something that average citizens can do, which is to help now, that because climate change is happening so fast. This is what the consensus position is now, that you can actually see maps of different tree species and where they are now and where they'll need to be in another 30 years or 60 years or 90 years. And they, unless you're a wind dispersed tree, you're not going to be able to make that unless we assist them. It's this whole field of assisted migration. And so people can take whatever, warm adapted seeds from their favorite tree and just move it a little bit further north. They're actually helping the entire green world move at a faster pace than typically they've needed to in the interglacials and the glaciers and stuff like that. So if anybody just puts Connie Barlow or just Leaf a Legacy, you can learn more about that. But she thought specifically that you might be interested in that as well.
Yes, that's very, very interesting. I am nervous always about adaptation plans, to the extent that they may take our energy away from stopping this madness.
Yes. No, I agree.
But she's absolutely right that it's an act of generosity and it's an act of renewal to do your best for the animals and the plants.
Yeah. Amen. Well, Kathleen, this has been wonderful. In addition to your riverwalking.com, where can people go to learn more about your work, or is that just they'll find access to everything there?
Well, they'll find a lot there. If they're so that's riverwalking.com or KathleenDeanMoore.com, same site. They also should go to moralground.com
Yeah.
because Moral Ground is a website that gathers blogs and work about that Moral Ground project of the reasons why we need to act on the behalf of the future. And what they'll find there is a discussion guide. So that if they have a circle of caring, if they have a study group, if they have a book club, they can get together with other people and they can discuss these various reasons for acting.
Wow, this
And
is
the
great.
other, yeah, and also there are a lot of suggestions in that discussion guide for how to turn those ideas, that moral principle, into concrete on the ground, forward moving action. So they might be very interested in that.
I'm very interested in that. I speak in churches, 2 or 3 times a week typically, and both on Sunday mornings and evening programs. And I'm now going to recommend. I've been recommending your book, but I wasn't aware of the study guide because of,
Yes.
invariably church groups and secular groups too sometimes, but certainly church groups often will ask, well, if we want to go deeper into these ideas, if we want to have a study group, what do I do? And now I'm going to recommend that. So thank you.
It's ready made, it's right there.
That's
And you
great.
know what? I use it in my classroom. And at the beginning of the class, I have what I call a hope-o-meter, where I ask the students, if 0 is there's no hope and 10 is there's no problem, where are you? And at
Yes.
the beginning of that class, they're 3, 4. These are college students, graduate students, 3, 4. But at the end of studying the moral ground, where they learn so much about um, about the challenges, when I do that, they have learned a couple points.
Yeah.
And I say, how could that be? You spend the whole term learning about the facts of climate change, and in the end, you're more hopeful? And the answer they give me is because we came into a community of people who really care,
Yeah.
and a community of people who are smart and engaged and interconnected, and that is what gives me hope.
Yeah.
So
Amen.
there is the study, but then there is the collective coming together for action that is so important.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, this is great. I just realized there's one other question that Connie has wanted me to ask, and I've remembered to ask most of the people that I've interviewed in this series, and it's a little off the wall, and I purposely don't let the people that I'm interviewing know about it ahead of time because I just want your fresh sort of like, oh wow, I got to think about that sort of response. If you were to have, invite for dinner or have a glass of wine or a cup of coffee or whatever, a conversation with any 3 figures in human history, who would those be and why?
Well, Thomas Hobbes would be there. He's the person who said that the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. I'd want somebody there who whom we could argue against, because you do want to have a good conversation. I would love to invite the Dalai Lama because he's so funny
Okay.
and his laugh is so beautiful.
Yeah.
And when you ask him about climate change, he doesn't talk about compassion. He talks about survival. I'd love to see those two minds together. Um, who would be the third?
Well, and it doesn't have to be somebody that would be the 3 or the 4 of you together. It could be just a one-on-one.
Oh, well, then I want to talk to Rachel Carson.
Yeah.
I absolutely want to talk to Rachel Carson, and I'd like to see her. I'd like to see her in a dust up with those other 2 guys too,
Yeah.
because I think she could absolutely hold her own. I would
I think
love to
she
see
could.
Thomas Hobbes and Rachel Carson in debate. But here's something about Rachel Carson. We need her so desperately. A person who can bring together the communication skills. She's such a beautiful writer, and the science, and the ethics. And people tear their hair and they say, "Oh, we don't have Rachel Carson anymore when we need her." So I've been urging people to form what I call Rachel Carson trios. Find a person who is a natural scientist on the scale of Rachel Carson. Find a beautiful writer. Find an ethicist, and come together, because the 3 of you together could be what Rachel Carson was alone.
I
And
love it.
so so that's my way of trying to honor Rachel Carson, is to say, you set this beautiful example, and some 3 of us could maybe do as well as you did.
I love it. I love it. Well, Kathleen, thank you so much for taking the time to be part of this series, and I just so deeply honor you and your own bringing together of moral philosophy, beautiful nature writing, a love of life, and a deep commitment to the future. So I just blessings on your work, and again, thank you for participating in this series.
Well, Michael, you're very kind, and back to you. I've been noticing, I've been reading, I've been on your websites and your YouTubes, and I think what you're doing is exactly what needs to be done. So thank you for that.
Thank you.